You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the HuffPost political editor, Kevin Schofield, and former number 10 speechwriter, Asa Bennett. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Treasons to be cheerful is the headline in the Metro, which describes how Ukraine is benefiting from the chaos within Russia after the Wagner Group mercenaries turned on Vladimir Putin's forces. According to the Financial Times, the aborted insurrection has laid bare the cracks in Putin's authority. And according to The Guardian, that's also the view of the United States. The Eye, meanwhile, says Mr. Putin has been remarkably silent since the whole incident ended. The Times says that British officials have been warned to prepare for the fall of Putin. The Mail leads with the breaking news tonight that Sarah, Duchess of York, has been treated for breast cancer. And the success of that treatment is the top story in the Express. The Telegraph has an interview with the Prince of Wales in which William says his life's work will be to end homelessness. And some like it hot. The Star has a warning to watch out for snakes in the hot weather. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by the HuffPost political editor, Kevin Schofield, and former number 10 speechwriter, Asa Bennett. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with the front page of The Eye. Their headline, Putin silent on mutiny that rocked the Kremlin. And it's quite odd that we haven't heard from President Putin, do you not think, Kevin, considering his threats and his calling out of treason from Yevgeny Prigozhin, but now silence?
Well, you're right, and there's been silence from Prigozhin as well, which is also very unusual. He's been very verbose in recent weeks with a lot of criticism of the Russian Ministry of Defence and the Kremlin. So, yeah, it does seem as if there's been some sort of deal has been done, obviously, to bring this putative coup to a swift end. It was a pretty manic day on Saturday. It went from beginning to end very, very quickly. And yeah, you're right. I think there's still an awful lot of unanswered questions. I think it is significant that both men are keeping their own counsel right now. There's still a lot of unanswered questions as to how, or what the details of the deal, how did it end so quickly when it looked as though the Wagner Group were on the verge of marching on Moscow, making incredible progress throughout the day on Saturday. Then suddenly it came to a halt. So yeah, it's still a very febrile situation. The consensus seems to be on the front pages that this is a huge blow to Vladimir Putin's authority, and I don't think there's any doubt about that. And yeah, it's still, I think, as I say, still to play out in full, this particular incident.
And Asa, do you agree that this has severely weakened President Putin?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a very febrile atmosphere now when you look at what's happening in Russia. Because, yes, Putin seems to then have seen off Prigozhin and reduced Prigozhin now to some sort of shadow of his former self, seeking practical exile in Belarus. And with the Wagner Group effectively being dismantled, the former plaything he'd built up effectively, this private army, now you have them all forcibly being conscripted into the Russian military. Those who did not take part, they'll be forgiven. But then even then, those who did not take part will still be very sort of cheesed off with Prigozhin for sort of misleading them, giving them these ideas, and suddenly they're all now sort of enemies number one, practically pariahs in the country. All in all, though, and the reason I lay that out, though, is I've struggled to see, when we talk about, oh yes, it's almost a deal or some sort of agreement, what the deal was. It feels a very one-sided deal, in a sense that only one of them, one of them still sitting very pretty indeed where they are, and perhaps what we're going to see is maybe this defense minister Sergei Shoigu gets sort of pushed out. But then if so, the trouble is then there's an endless conveyor belt of cronies for Putin who are still gung-ho about this war, so it won't really change very much.
Yeah, there is still a lot of speculation about the deal and a lot that we don't know. But I was reading that one of the conditions that's thought to have been is that the defence minister would be ousted. Kevin.
Yeah, that's right. That appears to perhaps have been one of the demands of the Wagner Group. And Asa's right. There's a suggestion certainly that Prigozhin is now going to live in exile in Belarus. I mean, I would be very nervous if I were him. Anyone who tends to speak out against Vladimir Putin tends to meet a rather sticky end. So someone who has quite openly criticised Putin and tried to effectively overthrow him, I think has to be particularly worried about their own personal security. So yeah, it certainly isn't over. As an incident. I think there is still it's still to play out in full, I think. But I think the bottom line, undoubtedly, is that this is the last thing really that Vladimir Putin wanted when he's already having to deal with the Ukrainian counteroffensive. The more time that he has to deal with internal security matters, it means that obviously there's less time for them to focus on the war itself in Ukraine. So yeah, it's left him weakened, but as Asa says, he is still in place. There was obviously speculation on Saturday that he could be overthrown within hours. At one point, it looked like that could potentially be on the card. So he is still in situ, but he's certainly much weaker than he was 48 hours ago.
Yes, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, though, Asa, has said that it's exposed real cracks in the Russian president's authority. And speaking to what you were saying before, that he has been severely weakened.
Completely. And I think you have to remember why and what has led us here. Simply put, it's Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, which he saw as the sort of almost what would have been the cherry on the cake of this messianic vision he had of trying to rebuild a sort of Soviet Union, a greater Russia, by retaking the lands he saw as ancestrally his. And yet it's backfired painfully and monumentally. It was meant to be a war that he thought he could win in about 2 days, and instead, many more months on, it's still dragging on. And you've basically finding the Kremlin's having to cover this up with, just pumping out lie after lie in terms of the casualty numbers being downgraded, trying to inflate the Ukrainian casualties, trying to spread all sorts of disinformation, in the media, lying to their own people, lying on the international stage, and he thinks he's having to try and believe his own stories. And so all in all, like he may think, this fake news is, that he's winning the war, that the Nazis in Ukraine, a complete bilge, of course, they're being seen off. But the thing is, Russia's been humiliated. And at the same time, people, the Russian elite, they can see this. They could talk privately about this stuff. They would never say it in public because they value their lives. But then Prigozhin has stuck his head above the parapet, and he's been the most prominent critic yet. So that's really shaken the foundations of the system.
And Kevin, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken also saying that we haven't seen the last act, and we read that there's an uneasy quiet in Moscow. Security remains tight, and we must remember also that the Wagner fighters, they remain in control of Russian military sites.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the first time that really the war, since it began last February, has basically come to the gates of Moscow. This is the first time that people in Moscow have had to confront their own personal safety. Now, the mayor of Moscow has given everyone in the city the day off tomorrow. And clearly there is an uneasy feeling in the city. They were starting to put up defences on the outskirts of Moscow when it looked as though the Wagner Group were going to enter the city at one stage on Saturday. This is unheard of. This hadn't this type of internal, almost on the brink of civil war. I mean, this hasn't happened in decades in Russia, and Putin now really has a job in his hands already. As Asa says, the war has not gone to plan, to put it mildly, and now he has this internal dissent that he has to try and dampen down. Now, obviously, he's been brutally effective in doing that in the past, but I think people now will look at his position as president in a different light. You know, he is incredibly vulnerable, and it remains to be seen whether he has a long-term future in the Kremlin. So yeah, it's still fascinating from a news point of view, a fascinating story to monitor. But what you have to remember is that even if Putin were to fall, that wouldn't be the end of matters. You know, this is still a hugely powerful nuclear-armed country, and you know, you wonder who would then follow and take Putin's place. So yeah, geopolitically, it's huge, really, and it's obviously of great concern to Britain and other Western allies.
Yes, and still very much a moving and changing story all the time. Asa, let's have a look at the Metro. Their headline, Treasons to be Cheerful. Is there a slight danger that the Western take on this story is a bit too triumphalist, do you think?
Well, it's really interesting here because Western politicians like Blinken, you've just alluded to, they've been very careful with their language for a very simple reason, because it risks getting played out across Moscow and Russian TV. And then it risks spinning and feeding a narrative that Putin and his team would love to feed, that, Prigozhin is some lackey or puppet of the West, and he's just been put up to this and, been stamped on by our brave, establishment and all this, Russia is strong and all, it kind of self-perpetuates. And so that's why, for example, there's some caution, among the political class. At the same time, in the media, well, I think it's interesting, and hey, the Metro does the sort of pun for this, and it's what it's trying to tie in, is that yes, there was this, a flash in a pan coup, but then also at the same time, Ukraine has recently launched its counteroffensive. And it's just a fact then that, if Russia is having to distract itself trying to suppress its own private military, and, then, and crucially, Wagner did take over Rostov, a key military section, fueling all sorts of troops, getting all sorts of supplies through to the front line. That has all sorts of disruption. Particularly when you compare it alongside what the Ukrainians are doing in their own way to sort of sabotage the supply chains, feeding Russian forces. So that's why people then may think there's a real wind in the sails of the Ukrainian army at the moment.
Let's have a look at The Guardian and this story, Kevin. Government officials asked if the late Queen would block Evgeny Lebedev's peerage because of concerns he could be a national security risk over his father's links to the Putin regime. This is coming out through a new documentary.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite an extraordinary story, this, and it appears that the Queen potentially was put in a rather invidious position by government officials. I mean, it would have been absolutely remarkable and probably, I think, unprecedented were the Queen or any monarch to intervene in the honours being recommended by a Prime Minister. In this case, surprise, surprise, Boris Johnson in trouble with his honours list again. And yeah, he put forward Evgeny Lebedev for a peerage, and security officials were led to believe were concerned given his father's KGB past. They saw this as a potential security threat. Boris Johnson was insistent, for whatever reason, that he wanted Lebedev in the House of Lords, and there was a clash effectively, and it looks like behind the scenes government officials were trying to get the late Queen to intervene to veto it. Now, unsurprisingly, the decision was taken that this would be a bad idea, for the obvious reason that you can't really have the Queen or any head of state, monarch, getting involved in this type of political process. However, it does show, however, the extent of the concerns that the security officials had about Lord Lebedev's, as he is now, peerage. So yeah, a remarkable story, and yeah, it just shows, even though he's no longer even an MP, you certainly can't keep Boris Johnson out of the headlines.
No, certainly still making the news. But the palace, of course, refused, Asa, we read.
Yes, no, they refused to get involved. And I think it's actually Kevin's explanation about how extraordinary such an intervention would have been explains effectively why they didn't get involved, because it would have been so very extraordinary to have set a precedent like no other, to have the monarch effectively picking and choosing and approving or not the peers. But then I think it also speaks to the depth of concern that was felt that, given there were concerns about the implications for national security, this, we must remember, would have been a peer that the Russian government has to approve of, because he wanted to have, Baron Lebedev of Moscow as well in his title. The level of sensitivity about that went to the very top.
Let's move on to the FT and this story, Kevin, about Tory MPs with, sitting in marginal seats, opting not to trot up to Westminster, but to stay in their constituencies and maybe sway the views of their constituents.
Yeah, well, I mean, this does make a lot of sense when you speak to Conservative MPs who actually do make it to Westminster. They're incredibly pessimistic these days, even ones who were willing to give Rishi Sunak a chance and thought that by bringing him in, he'd steady the ship, give the government back its credibility after Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, and that would give them a fighting chance at the next election. Even those people, when I speak to them now, are just incredibly pessimistic. So you can understand why Conservative MPs might want to spend more time in their constituencies, especially those who are reasonably marginal seats, because they are really at risk of losing their seats. So they need to get out on the doorsteps as much as they possibly can. Now, I'm sure a lot of voters, however, will be thinking to themselves, well, hang on a minute, we pay you to be in Westminster, so why aren't you there? Now, the reason for that they can get away with it is that it's a bit of a zombie parliament right now. The order of business each day pretty much ends very early. There's not a lot of legislation going through Parliament. So that is why the whips can afford to, in the parlance, slip these MPs so they don't have to be in Westminster and they can be, as I say, out on the doorsteps trying to drum up support. But I wonder whether it is too late. I spoke to one MP on Friday, Conservative MP, who said that the best they can hope for now is just to try and get as many MPs back as possible so they can be an effective opposition after the next election. That's how bad it is for Conservative MPs right now. So yeah, as I say, it makes sense that they want to get out there to do their best to try and save their seat. But I think for a lot of them, I think it'll probably be a bit too late.
Asa, we've only got about 20 seconds. Tell us about Elton John and his farewell concert tonight.
Well, I mean, I was just watching up on other channels before coming on, and what a guy! Absolutely, the kindest thing about him at the moment was that the stars he was bringing on, they're new talent. He's giving them a leg up while he's passing the torch on.
Elton John passing the torch on there. Well summed up. Asa and Kevin, thank you very much.